Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. The students who are here under coercion, thanks, Ambreen, for bringing them to us, and all the friends who've come from different parts of the university. I'm very pleased. This is the first event that International Politics is organizing, and I'm very excited about this panel. I'm really glad to be welcoming Professor Shweta Singh here. Thank you so much. I used to be one of her students way, way back when I was at Lady Shriram. So it's a special privilege to have you here. Without taking up a lot of time from the program, I'll just do a very, very quick introduction for Professor Singh. She's an associate professor at South Asian University. The book that we are discussing, Mapping Feminist International Relations in South Asia, Past and Present. She's one of the editors with Professor Mohsin, who's the other editor. And this book has been generating a lot of buzz as we've been observing in almost every policy space. How many book talks have you done? Thank you for putting us on the roster. So I'll hand over to Professor Singh and let her take it away. And as we kind of go along the panel, I'll keep introducing the speakers. Thank you so much, all of you, once again. Very excited. Take it away, ma'am.
Am I audible? I think it's just too loud. Okay, so, I have to say it's an absolute pleasure and joy to be here. And thank you, Devika, and for actually pulling us all together. And I have to say it's also a privilege to be meeting Ambreen, Palak, Kiran, Shivani, all of you in the room, Shweta. And it's just this kind of a dialogical space that keeps academics and academia going. So thank you, Devika. It's really a pleasure. Now, I was really thinking, where do I start? And I think for me, this has been a journey. This has been a journey of solidarity. This has been a journey of grief. This has been a journey of collaborations across borders in South Asia. And when I think about it, I thought since many of you are working in the space of gender politics, or not essentially feminist IR, but more broadly gender politics, I thought it's important for us to start thinking about how are we actually looking at this space, the production of this book, the epistemic authority, the genealogy around which we were working on. And I think, so the question that I thought was, where do I start to talk about the journey, the nudge, the provocation to write this book with Professor Meena Mohsin, who's the co-editor? It's epistemic journey, it's challenges. And I think one of the key things was we were both traversing what I call epistemic diktats. And I think all of you would be really familiar with it. This narrow disciplinary silos under which we work. And especially in the field of international politics, there are these epistemic diktats, there are these disciplinary diktats in terms of the epistemic authority. What is valid knowledge? What do we recognize as sites of knowledge production? Is it legitimate in the context of the process of knowledge production itself? So I think the key question when I started off was the what and how. What constitutes feminist international relations, and how do we study it? And I think, as I started this journey, I knew there were no straightforward answers, because one of the things that we start off with, just general thing as scholars in the field, we start to look at what is the available literature in the field. And you really have to do a quick search, and you will see that there are very few things or books or journals that you can classify within the disciplinary boundaries of what you can call feminist IR, So that was really, one of the nudges that started, that, just provoked me. Because the thing that I realized was that the literature in the field was messy. It was extremely messy. And I think what this messiness really provokes us to think is, and I think that is where I would say, the journey really started, in the messiness of the available literature. And in the messiness of the available literature, I think what I was hearing was move away from disciplinary silos. So if you look at the book itself, if you look at the collaboration itself, if you look at the voices itself, they're not firmly rooted only in the discipline of IR. They transcend to fields like anthropology. They transcend to fields like political science. They draw in on peace studies. So, the idea that the fact that I'm talking about this at the ideas, thanks to Devika, it was the truly interdisciplinary kind of a motivation that was moving us forward. And I would say that if you're talking about, I would say, we were not trying to fit in. We were not trying to be bound by these diktats. And I think that was the organic journey. And in that context, I think that also speaks about the region of South Asia, because one of the things that we really have to understand, and I think what we were attentive to in terms of the politics of knowledge production, that South Asia cannot be fit into a template. It's not that, I can import a particular template from the global north and say that here it is, that we're going to be studying about South Asia, be it feminist IR. So we were attentive to the politics of knowledge production, situated knowledge. And I think the point of emphasis surely was a continuing thread in the location of South Asia. And when I say the location of South Asia, I think what is particularly valid is that it does not refer to some authentic point of epistemic access, but in fact, it underlines the importance of a certain density of arguments within a lived community in the process of knowledge production. I think many of our ideas, and I think this is what I was just talking to Ambreen, many of the ideas actually begin from what I call sobremesa, conversations over tea and coffee outside the conversation, outside the conference room. And many of these ideas for the book in the context of the collaboration started when I visited Dhaka University way back in 2019, 2020, when Dhaka University was actually celebrating 100 years of IR. And interestingly, it is one of the oldest IR programs in South Asia. And it was one of the oldest programs also to introduce a course on gender in IR, which Professor Mohsin was teaching. So I think what really struck me was the many conversations that I had with colleagues and students at Dhaka. And if you ever happen to visit Dhaka University, you'll see the vibrancy of the space. And these conversations, were spread across, and it metaphorically takes me back, not just to the conference rooms, as I said, but to the chai ki tapris across campus. But these conversations, many of us were having, were not bound by boundaries. And these were not conversations that we were just having in Dhaka. We were having these conversations with colleagues in Sri Lanka. I was having these conversations in Afghanistan. We were having these conversations in Nepal. We were also having these conversations in Tromso, London, UK, US, across boundaries. And the only connecting thread for many of us who've been part of this project was a mutual feeling that we do not have a volume that brings voices from South Asia. And I want to actually double emphasize this, voices not on South Asia, but voices from South Asia. And many of us who engage with this idea, there was a kind of frustration. And this frustration was very real. I'm sure you see that in your classroom context also, when you have to teach a text. Is that really speaking to the context in South Asia? Or more specifically of the regions that you're talking about? And I think South Asia was being appropriated. And this is the epistemic authority of the global north. And I think there was need for disruption of this epistemic authority that we are talking about. And in the process, South Asia or countries within South Asia really became like these case studies. So there is this template that you have that emanates from the global north. And what do? You bring that template and test it in the global south. So there was this linearity that was attached to the process. Everything that was theory driven was coming in from the global north, and everything to substantiate that was coming from the global south. And I think that was a kind of a frustration that we were feeling with the appropriation of the knowledge systems that we have. And I think what was also happening in the process was there were erasures, and there were multiple erasures. We were talking about the politics of colonialism, coloniality, the marginalization, the silences across generations. And as I said, for us, it was also a conversation across generations. So it was located space, place, and age. So I think today's panel, the way Devika curated it, conceptualized it, was fascinating, because I think there was a need for this kind of a intergenerational conversation, because the context is different. So I think I wanted to emphasize on this idea of space, place, and age in the context of voices. And I think that brings me to the second point, which is moving away from the nudge of the epistemic disruption that we were talking about. I think we were also very attentive to the idea of conceptual innovation. What is the binding thread that runs through the book? And if you read the book, you'll see the different sections, and I highly encourage you to read the book. But what was the binding thread? And I think it's important that, as I said, what has stayed with me is that we were moving away, and in many ways, problematizing the idea of global sisterhood. I think for us in South Asia, that was an important trigger. I think we were attentive to the temporality of struggles that we are talking about, moving beyond this universalizing nation of global sisterhood. Because I think the intersectional identity constellations of race, caste, class, region, religion cannot be on the margins. So this universalizing notion of global sisterhood, while it's extremely interesting and important, we were in dialogue with that notion, but there were also dissident voices. And we wanted to recognize and acknowledge those dissident voices. And I think every time, and many of you are young students here in the room, something that has stayed with me, and I highly recommend that text, is Kumari Jayawardene's writings. And I think Kumari Jayawardene, writing in the 1980s, when even the discipline of IR was not very attentive to feminist IR, she was writing in that period. And something that she says, and I think that was something that inspired many of our ideas, was feminism was not imposed on the third world by the West, but rather the historical circumstance produced important material and ideological changes that affected women, even though the impact of this imperialism and Western thought was admittedly among the significant elements in the historical circumstance, unquote. So what was it? I think we were very clear. Gender and IR and feminist IR in South Asia was not a simple, straightforward template, but a more complex terrain mediated by differing terrains of colonialism, nationalism, and imperialism. And I think these ideas could not have been on the margins. So coming back to the point on conceptual innovation, I think what struck me and what struck Professor Mohsin in terms of the framing was we were foregrounding ideas on what I call the 3Ds: dialogue, difference, and dissidence. The 3Ds were very important for us in terms of framing the idea of feminist IR in South Asia. And in doing so, I think, as I said earlier, we were attentive to the politics of knowledge production, the erasures, the appropriations that I'm talking about. And more importantly, it was also a conscious attempt to disrupt epistemic authority that underpins the rubric of universalism and subsumes the particularities and struggles of entangled power relations. Second, I think while we were weaving the idea, and I think you will see, we were very attentive in this D to the idea of difference. So dialogue and dissidence was one, and what it was pushing us to think about was the idea of difference. And I do want to share some snippets of conversations that we were having during the workshop while we were shaping some of the initial ideas. And Ambreen, you would be able to comment on it more. But when we were looking at the section, trying to look at gender, for instance, and religion in South Asia, there were such differing voices from the field, and Sabagul Khatak from Pakistan was very attentive, and she would say, no, this is a very slippery terrain. How can we even talk about gender and religion in a IR? And many of us, we would want to talk about gender and religion in feminist IR. But the point here was she was situating it in the 1980s, 1990s, in the politics of liberal struggle and feminist movements in Pakistan. And we were located in this period when our struggles and temporality was very different. So conversations with Sabah would actually give us an insight into how we are even looking at the category of religion and gender in South Asia over these differing time and space. And that's why, I want to emphasize on this idea of intergenerational conversation. Also, the fact that how you were looking at the idea of religion, the idea of religion would be very different in a space like Bhutan. We don't have a contribution on Bhutan, something that we miss, but it would be very different in a space like Bhutan, very different in a space like Sri Lanka, very different in a space like India, and very different in a space like Afghanistan. So I think what I would say is within this idea of dialogue and dissidence, we were attentive to, we made an attempt to actually foreground the idea of difference. So if I'm going back to the question of the what of feminist IR, I think it's the plurality of the field, the differing strands within the field, the messiness of the field, that was something that was really provoking us. And I think now what I could do is, while I'm thinking this, and I thought, since I'm here, I could actually talk about it in the context of how we translated some of these ideas in the context of the book. And I thought I could start off with my own writing or my own chapter and then open it up for conversation. And I think The provocation, as I said, it's been a project in terms of mapping feminist IR, which I've been doing over a period of time. And I would sit in conferences, present in workshops, and I was quite tired. All of you are fascinated with literature on national security, the question of identity, national identity, the question of civilizational histories. And when I would be sitting in those conference rooms, all I would hear about is Kautilya, you know, Kautilya's Arthashastra, and it kind of provoked me. It made me angry. I was raging, and I was like, and I've been a history student in my undergrad days, and I was like, is there no text in the context of the genealogy of feminist histories that speaks to the discipline of IR? And while I was doing that, I was very attentive that, I cannot be reductionist. So I can't really go back and say, oh, I'm going to appropriate this and this is what IR is about. So it was a slippery terrain again. And that pushed me to go back to the archives. I started looking and Susie Tharu and Lalita's work, it's a collection of women's writings from the third or the fifth century to the contemporary times. And I think that, pushed me towards reading the Therigatha. And I think the Therigatha was fascinating. It opened my eyes to this whole context of alternative histories and alternative genealogy, the voice from below. I won't call it like completely subaltern in that context, but it was something which really provoked me to think about some of the ideas, questions of power, questions of intersectionality, questions of agency, questions of voice. And I can really say that Therigatha has been relegated on the margins of the disciplinary boundaries as something that you might pick up in the discipline of English literature to read as a translation, but you will not pick up a Therigatha to do strategic studies in IR. And I think that was the provocation. Disrupt that kind of epistemic authority over what is legitimate. Because to my mind, if you were talking about a genealogy of feminist IR in South Asia, the sites were very important. What we recognize as legitimately as IR. So I think that's where, my engagement with Therigatha started. And as I read through Therigatha, I just, for all of you to be on the same page, just a brief backdrop on the Therigatha. It's actually an anthology of 73 poems that has been written by the Theris or Buddhist monks. And it has been written in the Pali canon. So there was a twofold objective when I was thinking about the epistemic authority. One was the politics of language, because many a times we do not look at texts which are not written in English language, even in the context of politics of translation. You could pick up any of the IR journals and start to look at what is being published, what is cited, where is it being published, what is the politics of gatekeeping around it. And you will really see the kind of epistemic gatekeeping that happens. But if you pick up the Therigatha, it was a text that was written in the 3rd and the 6th century BC, as I said, by the Buddhist monks. And these are documented as gathas or songs. Now, I would say this is one of the earliest set of writings by women in ancient India. And one was very attentive to the fact that it could be a revisionist project, because if you try to bring it to the context of presentism, but I wanted to engage with the text in itself, in the situated context that we are talking about. Text in its context, and recognize the constraints in which these women were writing during that period. And I think what I would say is, while these poems might not present feminist vocabulary in line with Western templates of feminist theory, yet they bring to fore key insights from the standpoint of voice, from the standpoint of agency and intersectionality, all of which are relevant to thinking about feminist genealogy of IR. So, where do you begin the story? There are these differing sides. And it was not just in the context of Therigatha. This is what you see in the book, but something that we are developing further is that you have to look at many of these texts in differing context in South Asia. So, for instance, you could be looking at Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussein's work and the idea of feminist utopia, an idea of an alternative order and power that we are talking about. And Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussein's work is fascinating. It's also intersectional, because this was a Muslim woman growing up during periods of colonial time, imagining a world without men. So, challenging this whole kind of the idea of power and order that we are talking about. Similarly, there is some very interesting work that has been done in the Telugu literature and the Malayalam literature, in Assamese, in Bengali. And it's a mine, I would really encourage you, young students, to go beyond what is visible in the textbook and start unraveling some of these ideas. And I think here, what really, really struck me, and I want to go back to Hannah Arendt here, freedom is to call something into being. And I want to emphasize that freedom is to call something into being which did not exist before, which was not given, not even as an object of cognition or imagination. And that is what was shaping the content and the character of feminist IR that one was looking at. Thus, the attempt was, as I said, to look at these generative sites within these texts, for instance, the Therigatha. And in doing so, one was really challenging an ideological order. Now, when I say that, there are some of the key ideas that I engage from the Therigatha, and you would see it in the chapter. But one of the things that you would often read in the literature on IR and also peace studies is the continuum of violence. You would often hear this thing about continuum of violence, the categories of violence. And if you start looking at the Therigatha, there are patterns of grief, sorrow, solidarity, transnational struggles that you can discern from the reading of these poems. And these were the first Buddhist women who were monks who were writing this. And if you look at it, this is the politics in terms of recognizing and foregrounding the voice that we are talking about. So if I could just go back, for instance, there is a Rohini poem, and I could go back to that poem, but in the Rohini poem, what really comes in is an alternative idea of community. Now, this idea of community is extremely important when we are thinking about the idea of community in a space in South Asia. I'm not talking just in the context of the social, but I'm talking in the context of the political. And I think that was fascinating. Similarly, on the idea of agency, I'll draw your attention to the voice of Mutta. And if you read the text, and this is a very powerful translation by Hallisey, and I'm going to read the few lines, quote unquote, "The name I'm called by means freed, and I'm quite free. Well, free from three crooked things: mortar, pestle, and husband, with his own crooked thing. I'm freed from birth and death, and that leads to rebirth has been rooted out." I think it's self-explanatory. It's not just women's writings without politics in it. It is the politics of the space that we need to draw attention to. So I think why I'm saying this is pay attention to the historicity of the region. For me, histories was very important. Pay attention to the temporality of the struggle. And I think when you walk through the field of feminist IR in your own journey, hear, see, listen, read all the dissident voices. And that is what pushes the envelope and disrupts epistemic authority. I would actually sign off right now because I would want to have more like a dialogical conversation and hear from Ambreen, Palak, and Kiran, and all of you in the room, because that is really the kind of dialogical space. The book is out there. And I'm very curious to see how it is received. What are the dissident voices vis-a-vis the book? Because there was also the politics of collaboration in terms of the epistemic production of this book at the South Asian University and University of Dhaka. So in the context of the dialogical spaces that we are talking about, many of the chapters have also been written in collaboration. So that's where we are. And so I would just nudge you, all of you younger people here, to look at sites what you would not conventionally recognize as IR. So move beyond those conventional imagery in the context of IR. Thank you.
Thank you so much, SS. I'm not going to call you ma'am because you told me not to. There are so many takeaways that we kind of get towards the end once we've had our planned speakers speak. But I just want to offer three S's based on what your talk made me think of. And they are sight, situationing, and someness. And when you kind of think about the entire point that she made about how everything is political, right? How do we navigate this space of reading, studying, teaching? I remember I used to make this joke to some of my friends that, I used to think my PhD was tough. But once I started teaching, that was something totally different and hard in its own way. Just the politics of being a woman who's teaching IR, which is never considered to be really a feminist or a feminine space. What happens when women come and quote military numbers at you? Is that the only way to get your attention, or can the topics that we research also be valid core subjects in an IR degree? But yeah, those are thoughts, and we'll get into them later. So the way we planned this was we wanted to get the younger feminist guns that we have here. Kiran, who's a PhD scholar at Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at School of International Studies, JNU, and young Palak, who's currently a teaching assistant at Ashoka University, but used to be a student at Jindal, was one of my first students, in fact, at JGU, and is now currently working at Ashoka. So we'll give you the first go, Kiran. Kiran's going to be talking to us about her own experiences of doing research on epistemology, feminist methods, and I'm excited about you sharing what you have been talking to us about in the car on our way to JGU. Take it away, Kiran. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Just press this.
This one.
Yeah. So I'm really excited and at the same time just to be here. I was looking forward to reading this book since I saw the first tweet by ma'am, and really amazing that I'm here to share my views on this. So the way I thought I'll structure my presentation, the title is Imagining IR Differently, Feminist Epistemological Interventions from South Asia. A lot of it is already like covered by ma'am's comments, but I would be sharing what my major takeaways from the book were in terms of epistemological interventions. Also, just some of the insights I have during my own research. So, just beginning with this one question feminist scholars and have heard all the time, how is this IR? I'm tired, irritated of listening to this. And I know it's like about time we just stopped worrying about it, but it's like this is sociology, this is anthropology, anything but IR. And I think that's where this tells us that how feminist IR is actually pushing the boundaries of the discipline constantly. So this question is perhaps just showing us where we are challenging the field, and also at the same time I feel it's a so the book is now providing us a strong ground for saying that this is IR. It's reimagining IR in that sense. So it challenges the epistemic authority. The introduction and Professor Singh also talked about epistemic disruption, and that's I feel is really important thing here. It reimagines knowledge, methods, ontology, epistemology through the various chapters and contribution of the book. What I wanted to really talk about, and a major takeaway for me was Anique Wibben in her work talks about that how feminist work on security or international relations predates the discipline of feminist security studies or feminist international relations. What I feel this book does and is like a pioneering work in that sense, it predates feminist thoughts from the global south, even not only before the origin of feminist security studies or feminist IR, but beyond the origin of IR itself. So we are able to see like from the chapter on Therigata or from Jahanara Begum's letters, like the way another contribution in the book is looking at the strategic thought of Jahanara Begum or reading poetries. So these are coming from ancient and medieval history. So it's way before the discipline of IR was imagined. So we are pushing temporarily also the boundaries of the discipline in that sense. The book is doing that. Coming to the major themes I wanted to talk about was like first, because we are talking about epistemology, the sources of knowledge, and how the book is pushing in that direction. Another one is the process of knowing or the methodology. And the third one was the limit of knowledge or what we can do further from here. First, beginning with the sources of knowledge, a lot of which is already covered by Professor Singh, so I will be speaking less on this. But again, the major thing was South Asia as like a place for knowledge and conceptual theoretical production, not just an place to test or try case studies. And then probably pushing us towards what studying IR means. Like again, whether it's reading Terigata or reading Jahanara Begum's letters, like letters of women at various places to see their thought as strategic thought, as thoughts of IR on war, peace, and security. There's also Medha Bish chapter, which looks at Indian philosophical tradition. So drawing feminist, so building a relational connection between indigenous epistemologies and feminist thought. So she looks at Anvikshiki and Shunyata as two concepts and brings them to IR and actually puts presents a big gap in the discipline in terms of meta meta theoretical thought. So that's where we can build from these places also. Another really interesting aspect of the book was bridging the activist and academic divide. So like this, there's a tension between being a scholar and activist, and I feel this is where in past 2 years I've been part of a feminist network called South Feminist Futures, which has worked on knowledge production. There's a project they worked on called South Feminist Manifesto, which involved having virtual consultations with feminists across global South. And this was the most amazing experience I could have had. So then I remember at one of the in-person meeting we had, this senior feminist scholar from Africa asking me, what do you see yourself, as an activist or an academician? And I was like, until before that day, I haven't seen myself as an activist. And that's how she told me that this work of knowledge production, this is also activism. Like academia and activism need not be these two separate places. So I think the book also, while talking about so many feminist movements across South Asia, whether it be the Sri Lankan movement on the divorce and marriage acts, or the WPS, there are chapters on the WPS and the how they are also drawing from grassroots movements. So this is another important aspect I think feminist IR and the book is pushing towards. Now, finally, coming to the process of knowing or the methodology, I think it's again about reimagining methods. So now we are not just reading documents from state or UN international organization, but reading poetry, like poetry as political thought, or letters as personal letters as archives, or philosophy as IR. Like these are the three major uh, interventions or reimagining of methods, text, and sites, as Devika Di just mentioned. Also, there's an I'm glad because I'm also really a fan of the aesthetic turn in IR and how that is coming to both feminist IR and South Asia as a context in the book. There's a chapter by Kahanda Gamage, I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, on wall art and populism in Sri Lankan politics. It looks at Sri Lankan murals and how they came up, how they depict a particular kind of militaristic masculinity, and how the politics of populism works in there. There's a chapter by Dipti Tamang on Darjeeling and the everyday security, everyday militarization, and there also she used photography as an important way to analyze the everyday politics. So I think there's so much more that can be done in terms of the aesthetic turn and combining it with the feminist turn. Yeah, so now finally coming to the, and here I'll be ending things, is the limits of knowledge, or what I feel, what more the the tensions of the field is, or the tensions the book also opens up to us, is I was really moved by the chapter by Sabah Gul Khatak, like the amount of violence the women of the region has faced. She talks about the violence during partition, the 1971 Bangladesh war, COVID-19, but she also very strongly warns about the risk of co-optations. And that's something I've also thought about, like feminist IR being used by state or nationalism. And one thing I've been thinking about lately is how the concept of feminist foreign policy might be used by states for the same in the same way. And how do we as feminist scholars like resist that, like making, and there's also this need to have a conversation with policy, because we cannot just like push back and say we will not engage. So this tension between engagement and criticizing, I would really like to hear your thoughts on that, ma'am. And finally, this another dilemma which the big book brings forth, uh, again in Sabagul Khatak's chapter and also Medha Biss chapter, is avoiding the trap of essentialism while we are drawing from indigenous knowledge systems. This is something we are already witnessing in India a lot. Talking about drawing from like how the whole concept of decoloniality can be used for a completely different end of marginalizing communities and creating more violence, more hatred, using it as a trope to further nationalism. So that's again, I think, is an important concern for feminists, that how do we like see that. So this broader question of resisting co-optation while sustaining feminist knowledge production. Finally, another insight, like I was lucky enough that I found a platform to have these transnational conversation that opened up my mind so much, talking to feminists from Africa, from Latin America. But are there ways in which we, that was an activist setting, and while I wouldn't like to have this distinction, but can we together build a platform for a transnational communication between feminists, probably an academic circle, academic slash activist? How do we take forward these conversations? So I think that's just it. So the book is about expanding IR and reimagining it. And that was my major takeaway from it. And how do we go forward from here, taking all these tensions, and how do we build on these? Thank you.
Fabulous, Kiran. Thank you so much. And we're so excited for you finishing your PhD and going out in the world. And you're already out in the world, but like going out in the world with a doctorate. Let me clarify. Um, Again, this point that Kiran has made about this activist, academic divide, it's something that all of us struggle with, and struggle with not just in the sense that, oh, we are trying to find a balance between our values and our teaching, but also struggle with the posturing, right? Like what Professor Singh was mentioning when she said this, that the global sisterhood is a myth. And to just give a sense to all the young students who are here before we kind of move on to Palak, I still remember being in a workshop in Brazil at the International Feminist Journal of Politics conference, and it was supposed to be this beautiful feminist space. It was young women, queer people, and headed by three very white, very well established feminist scholars. And at one point of time, I started crying, and I said, "Oh, you know what? I think it's never going to be enough. I don't know how I'm going to do Latin American studies. It's so hard." Then there was another young girl, she started crying and she started talking about how she was in a postdoc, and because she didn't have a stable job, she'd had to get an abortion because she couldn't afford to have a child. And then the third girl started crying and she said, "You know what, but you women are so beautiful. I'm constantly struggling with self-doubt, my body image." And this very well-established feminist queer icon eventually just came, and to me that was a feminist community of care. That was women talking about doing academia with care, hearing each other out. But this very well established scholar basically shushed us, told me, "You know what, you can always become the biggest person who does Latin America in your own country." And a person who's in the US and studies Latin America from there told the girl who had the abortion that children aren't everything, and told the girl with the body dysphoria issues, "It's something we all struggle with, and that's fine." And then said, "Oh, we need to get to the constructive business of doing the workshop," which was clearly not the feminist conversation. And this is why I find this divide very interesting. And it reminds me of what Nakutullah always said, this first generation Black woman from South Africa who becomes a professor, had a child when she was 17. And she says, "I got my degree, and my mother said the university took my daughter away from me." So a lot to unpack and a lot to think about. We'll now move on to young Palak. Very sorry, I keep saying young Palak because that's a joke, but we'll move on to Palak, who's going to be talking to us about absences, if I'm not wrong, and talking a little bit more in detail about the second section of the book. Take it away, Palak, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to everyone who's spoken before me. I've learned so much from just reading this book. And the section that I am actually talking about is the second one in the book. It's called the WPS Agenda in South Asia, Rethinking Women, Peace and Security. So before I come to the book of the hour and talk about women, peace and security, I would like to talk about another book and the lives of its central women characters. I read The Little Coffee Shop of Kabul by Deborah Rodriguez years ago. This was before the Taliban's full takeover of Afghanistan in 2021. It was an international bestseller. It is not a great book though, so I feel no guilt as I spoil it for you completely in the next few lines. So the women of the book lead the following lives. Sunny, an American woman, runs the eponymous coffee shop, which, by the way, caters exclusively to expats. And she is torn between two equally boring white men and finds herself in a love triangle. Yasmina, a young Afghan woman, she's pregnant and is left on the streets after her husband leaves her to become an insurgent. Isabel, a determined war journalist who has experienced everything, including sexual assault, in a conflict ridden region because of her job. And finally, we have Halajan, a 60-year-old grandmother who is having a torrid love affair with a very young man. The violence of the streets around them actually aids the secrecy of their affair and provides a distraction to anyone who would want to moral police them. The point of telling you about this book and its women is to bring to light varied experiences of women from different sections of society in the same city. A relatively privileged woman's enterprise, the coffee shop, keeps all of these women afloat in one way or another. This space is also the one where their stories become enmeshed. While it does give them the necessary means for survival, it also misinterprets the moral and behavioral codes of their lives. Much like what the WPS agenda does to the women's movements of the global south. So, this brings me to the fundamental question of the second section of Mapping Feminist IR in South Asia. What do we think about when we rethink women, peace, and security from a South Asian lens? The chapters by Beena Da Costa, Swati Parashar, Shaumita Basu, Poonam Yadav, and Leilufar Yasmin provide varied insights on this. These texts are tied together by several important themes. Now, just to start off, the WPS, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, is a bunch of UN resolutions that talk about women affected by and in turn affecting conflict in several regions of the world. This came together in the beginning of the 21st century, and conversations around the WPS agenda have been ongoing. So, all these texts in the second section, these are tied together by several important themes. And some of these threads and some of these conversations I'll go through in the next few minutes. So the first thing I notice is that several things get overlooked when even a well-meaning policy project like the WPS agenda is created through high-level advocacy at multilateral levels without taking into account local realities. So Da Costa and Parashar have emphasized that feminism in the South Asian region is richly textured, but also contentious at times. Movements in the region, even those led primarily by women or with the goal of resolving issues that affect women the most, may not claim a feminist identity. In fact, they go one step further to say that several foreign policies of South Asia embody virtues of fairness and justice while not explicitly claiming the feminist tag. From India itself, several environmental movements like Chipko or Narmada Bachao Andolan, etc., have been led by women. Now, shouldn't they comprise an important aspect of the WPS discussion as well? So, that is a question. That is a thread of questions that several of these chapters ask together. The second theme that was prominent is that South Asian borders and national security do not exist in silos from each other. And here I would like to bring an example from my own research, one of my own research projects on the India-Myanmar border. The military coup in Myanmar, the recent one, led to a significant wave of migration from the Chin state in Myanmar to India's Mizoram state. So this was also precipitated by ancestral links between the indigenous communities in both regions. Now, in a region where borders a lot of times are colonial constructs, how can national security exist without regional cooperation? I would like to quote here from Basu's chapter. It, quote starts, "It has become hard to narrate an Afghan, a Pakistani, or indeed an Indian story divorced from internecine conflict, internal or international." Close quote. It therefore becomes critical for the region, transnational solidarity groups, civil society organizations, and multiple governments to work together to achieve any of the tenets of the WPS agenda. And the third thread that seems prominent to me is that of the security forces' involvement in the WPS issues. Now, when security forces deliberate on these issues, policy making becomes a deeply gendered process, which is directly underlined by hierarchical interactions between the security sector and the local communities. Basu further states that the WPS agenda has been denounced for gender washing interventionism of powerful countries in the global south. Now, this ties directly from what Kiran also talked about, that this has helped sustain and further global power asymmetries. An example here would be the US-led intervention in Afghanistan using women's rights and security as a key rhetoric to justify their own deployment in the country without actually giving local women the power to make decisions. And the fourth theme that I thought about while reading this section was the shadow of traditional gender on the WPS discussion. Now, Da Costa and Parashar bring to light that talking about women's rights leads to anxieties about the corruption or breaking down of traditional norms and structures in society, which might be the most unique South Asian issue you could find out there, in my opinion. So, Yasmin, in the final chapter of the section, shows that there have been multiple instances where women's perceived peaceful identities have been challenged in South Asian conflicts. For example, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, had one of the fiercest suicide squads, with a third of their members being women. The peacefulness ascribed to them was key to them getting access to and assassinating the Indian Prime Minister in 1991. So now, but the interesting thing is, these women were not just seen as cool and empowered in their community, they were, but also sacrificial for their children and community, just like a mother figure. And a second example that Yasmin shows is how women make a considered and informed choice to join extremist groups. So Bangladesh's National Action Plan, the NAPs are policy documents that several countries have come out in relation to the WPS agenda. Bangladesh's NAP assumes that women are just vulnerable prey for recruitment, and it is men who must be luring them into extremism. There are calls for a more nuanced understanding of women's nature, divorced from traditional thinking, and the need to embed this characterization at the policy level to be able to make better policy, to be able to have this consideration. And finally, there is something about institutions and implementation of policy. A good policy always takes implementation into account. Trust me, I know my primary job is working in governance and administration in a university. So, according to Yadav, Nepal's National Action Plan doesn't take into account their own institutional unreadiness for adequate implementation of the tenets of their policy. Even though this SNAP actually came as a global project with special funding and received widespread acclaim globally, it was not well integrated into the local government structure. So this brings me to the end of the themes, but just to round off my talk, I would like to narrate an incident from a badly written but well-produced piece of media. This British TV show called Bodyguard, starring Richard Madden. In the first few minutes of the show, our military hero Richard finds himself on a packed train trying to thwart a bomber. Stay with me here. It turns out that the bomber vest wearing person is a hijab clad woman who has been apparently deceived by her husband into going on the train with the bomb. Richard claims Richard calms the panicked Bechari woman down, carefully gets the bomb from her, and defuses it just in time. Well, long story short, in the final episode's interrogation room scene, we find out that the lady was actually the bomber. She pretended to be a Bechari when she realized that she would be caught by the small military platoon that had boarded the same train. Our military hero is shocked when he comes to know that this lady was the mastermind all along. So, leaving you with this thought, thank you for listening.
It was awesome, Palak. Thank you so much. And though you've set me up, I feel, with your anecdote, because the next speaker is Ambreen, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how feminist and gender discourses get mobilized in nationalist productions, especially with the experiences in India and Pakistan. And I don't feel it's fair to go from your story about Bechari hijab clad bomber and give it to the one scholar who talks about gender and Islam in the school. But I'm so glad that we were able to have this little cocoon. When we were setting up the panel, the idea was we should have two big stalwarts and we should have two young guns who are right in the middle, and I come and tell a couple of jokes so that we all keep laughing. Thank you so much, Ambreen. The floor is yours and we are excited, and you have to speak. for at least 10 minutes.
Yeah. Thanks, Devika. And thank you, Shweta, for writing this book. Specifically, I like the idea of what you were talking about, disrupting epistemic authority and also moving beyond boundaries, disciplinary boundaries. And this is where I would like to come in, talking about the plurality of the field with a special focus on gender and nationalism, which plays a very, gender is basically mobilized in nationalist movements. And I was looking at the book, reading this chapter by Anushka, again, the same chapter that you mentioned by Kahat Mage. She's basically studying a wall art wave in Sri Lanka, wherein she finds that how the warrior masculinities are more privileged or have a more privileged position on the streets in a highly militarized Sinhalese Buddhist society. And she analyzes these paintings, this wall art, and basically this then becomes the subject of a street art and her study also, and also is very relevant from the standpoint of gender and populism in the Sri Lankan context. So drawing in from there, I want to look at religion and militarized nationalism, both religious nationalism and militarized nationalism in India and Pakistan. And because both the states have employed narratives to promote gender narratives, to promote their nationalist agendas. And if we look at the work of feminist scholars over years, we see that they have long argued that the constructions and the norms of gender and sexuality have are very crucial to the process of state formation, very crucial to the process of national belonging. And states are, if we agree, are founded on violence and expulsion. No, all states have come into existence on the basis of violence and expulsion. So when I talk about violence and expulsion in the context of India and Pakistan, I'm bound to go back to the period of partition and and basically the tales of partition, the partition era, which is 1947, and also the liberation war in Bangladesh in 1971. And there are two very prominent scholars, historians that I think so most of us are aware about, Urvashi Butalia and Yasmin Saikia. So Saikia has basically looked at the women in Bangladesh and the making of Bangladesh and the war. And while Urvashi Butalia's work, very prominent work, The Other Side of Silence. So both these scholars demonstrated that women's bodies were basically inscribed with meanings beyond individual agency. The idea that these bodies were treated as sites of honor, as sites of revenge, as sites of control, political control. And specifically, if you look at Batalia's work, we see how women are used as symbols of honor, and this is communal honor, right? And this suffering for long was silenced. And this silencing of the suffering had a particular agenda, which was basically to preserve nationalist narratives. So, to preserve this narrative, you had to silence the experiences of the women who were basically violated in that period. And so, she's basically documenting one very particular incident, which I think so is also a theme of several movies that came up later. It's called the Thoa Khalsa incident. And this is a very tragic case of 90 women in Thoa Khalsa, which is basically a Sikh dominated village. And these 90 women were made to jump in the wells during the partition to basically escape abduction and rape by men of the other side, which is basically Muslim men. And but these deaths or suicides rather were framed as acts of martyrdom, and so the whole idea of reframing their deaths as acts of martyrdom rather ended up reinforcing honor codes, that honor basically rests in the bodies of women, and one must prefer dying than basically get violated by men of the other community. And so the all the surviving families of the time, they often silenced discussions of these events, which again highlighted how women's agency was erased in nationalist discourses. And apart from these women who were basically who were who died by jumping into the well. There were other women, they were called the recovered women. And this is basically long after the partition. The governments of both India and Pakistan constituted a committee. They launched a recovery operation to bring back their abducted women. And many of these women by that time had converted, had set up their own families, they had started new lives, and yet they were repatriated against their will. So there was this woman that Butalia discusses is who basically resisted being rescued, and because she not only got married, she also had a family. She had children with her Muslim husband, and so this also she argues is that basically how the state prioritizes national purity, over individual women's agency. So despite the resistance, she was basically rescued. And similarly, in the Bangladesh context, we look at the idea of Birangana, or the war heroine, or the rape survivor in the 1971 Liberation War. And here again, we see that women's bodies become markers of religious identity, of national identity. And this very term was basically, Berangana was basically given to Bangladeshi women who were raped in 1971 Liberation War. So the title was largely meant to give them honor, that and but often it led to social ostracization, because the society would not accept. They were violated women, they were women who were polluted, and they were not fit for marriage. And so there were women who were being celebrated in public and simultaneously being abandoned in private by their families. And so you also look at this basically tells us about the hypocrisy of the nationalist discourse. So both Butalia and Saikia's work challenge the mainstream historical accounts by shifting the focus from dominant nationalist narratives to the lived experiences of women, and basically exposing the silences, the erasures of women's in official histories, right? And so also they challenge the mainstream history that glorifies partition or the liberation war as struggles for national self-determination, which is often portrays men as the primary agents of history. And how are they challenging it? By basically showing women not just as passive victims of the violence that's happened, but also as central to these conflicts. And they are central to these conflicts in different ways. So either they are suffering or resisting or even surviving in ways that nationalist discourse often ignores. And in these cases, we see how women's suffering is often used as propaganda by the state for their own, of course, agenda. But it is also later disregarded, right? That they're very suffering. And this is what I also found common in this chapter on Sri Lanka, where women are not the leaders of populist nations, and they because they are seen as an embodiment of virtuousness, and virtuousness, which is basically attached to the Sinhalese Buddhist discourse. And so men are basically glorified as the male body, while the female body is something which is not permitted to be out in the public space there, right? And which is visible not only in the real life, but also in the art. So the street art doesn't depict women at all, but it's only dominated by the militarized masculine bodies. And so this is, I think, where feminist IR comes in to examine how nationalist movements construct gender roles, often using women as symbols of honor, purity, and cultural integrity. It not only influences internal gender politics, domestic politics, but also reinforces broader South Asian trends of militarized patriarchal nationalism. And I'll just go back briefly to the idea of propaganda and gender in the post-colonial nation state of Pakistan here. And this is Shanira Khoja Mulji's work, where she's basically looking at two contenders of sovereignty. So you have the Pakistani state, the legitimate contender of sovereignty, and the Taliban. And both these contenders have their own set of cultural productions of what basically constitutes a nation. who belongs, who doesn't belong, who's included, and who's excluded from this idea of the nation. And basically, they're doing this to forge a relationship with the public. And in forging this relationship with the public, both the contenders employ discourses of gender. And not only that, in the Pakistani case, they also employ discourses of Muslimness. And in doing this, gendered hierarchies, kinship feelings, normative understanding of Islam as to what is Islam and what is not Islam are again reinforced by these two contenders. And if we look at the texts and the scripts of the state and the Taliban, we see that they are basically replete with gendered figurations. So, what are these gendered figurations? You have the paternal father, an innocent child, a mourning mother, a brave soldier, a resolute believer. Then you have a dutiful, oblique, undutiful daughter. And both state and Taliban then foster attachments to their very specific visions of the political by relying on scripts of gender, sexuality, normative Islam, family, imaginations of the past, and a future. And so this book also shows that relationships of sovereignty in Pakistan are nurtured through performances of masculinity and performances of Muslimness. Basically, a melding of Islam and Muslimness comes together. And both the state and Taliban then mobilize women's figurations as kin to hail paternal and fraternal publics. And so there are many feminist scholars from Pakistan, for instance, Anila Zeib Babar, Rubina Saigal, Lala Rukh, and they basically show how popular and state-produced cultural texts, whether they are songs of war, whether they are art, architecture, they basically inform public opinion over who must die and who should be protected, who deserves protection and who must be put at the war front. So cultural production and texts and these, if you look at these things, the figure of the violated Muslim sister is basically the core of the Taliban archives, you know, and this basically binds male readers as brothers. As brothers, why? Because they see themselves as experiencing humiliation for allowing the violation of the sisters. And so the whole idea is to avenge this past injury, and not only to avenge the past injury but also to forestall any kind of future injury. And this fraternal public is then called to join the Taliban's political project. You know, so it's basically on the idea of a violated Muslim sister that they mobilize their public. And also the concept of invoking the idea of the khilafat, that matter, in the magazine. So they have a lot of magazines and also online texts. And this basically, what is the idea of invoking an idea of khilafat? Is basically to arouse nostalgia for past Muslim glory, and also stoking ambition for reproducing that political order in the present. And likewise, the Pakistani state, here the army plays a very central role, and they basically advance figurations of the mourning mother and in their songs. So there are annual events by the army where mothers of slain soldiers are invited, and then they are basically commemorated their sacrifice and everything. So mothers are allowed to grieve the loss of the sons, but they are basically called to reframe this entire exercise as a sacrifice for the nation. And so the figure of the mourning mother becomes very central to the politics of the Pakistani army to and then reattach themselves to the state. And in both these cases, we see that how allied publics are then created that learn appropriate ways of attaching either to the Taliban or to the state. And in both cases, gender plays a very central role. So it is conceptualized and so what we see is that gender is being conceptualized and mobilized to forge solidarities, to foster attachment with one, and also kind of ambivalence with the other. So one who's attaching themselves to Taliban is very ambivalent towards the state, and the one who's basically attaching themselves to the state are ambivalent of the Taliban. So this is the kind of thing that runs there. And similarly, to be talking about gender and religion and mobilization nationalism, it would be unfair to not to mention India. And because we see masculinization of Hinduism in contemporary India, right? And for instance, the whole reshaping of Hindu identity through hyper masculine lens. So there is a lot of emphasis on aggression, physical strength, dominance, and all of this is basically in response to perceived historical victimhood or any kind of present day threats. And it is this trend of remasculinization of religious figures, for instance, Ram or Krishna, by the Hindu right. As while this is happening at one end, there's also a categorization of women that's happening. So women are either being categorized as mothers or as female warriors. But these female warriors, it's basically happening in the context of the threat from the other, right? And this trope of our women and their men runs very common in the discourse of Hindu masculinity and the nation. And so, for instance, this concept like love jihad. This is something which basically mirrors very patriarchal nationalist anxieties about women's bodies being sites of religious and national honor. So, in this context, larger context of South Asia, there are a number of studies, recent studies, and even before Charu Gupta has worked extensively on male anxieties and Hindu anxieties. And there are scholars that examine the larger co-articulation of masculinity and power, basically how masculinities are continually reshaped by historical legacies, by cultural narratives, by migration, social political movements, and how these basically construct and influence power dynamics. This is where I'll stop. Thank you. 10 minutes.
Yeah, you did it. I'm proud of you. Thank you so much, Ambreen, for that fascinating breakdown. And again, that point that you were making right in the beginning of not being in a disciplinary silo, So it's great to see how political science and IR, which should be sisters, but at least in India, I don't know, IR is like the errant playboy child, I feel. There are 4 departments for IR. So it's great to kind of have this conversation. Uh, I'll open the floor up to questions. We seem to have lost some students, but thanks, guys. You have stuck around throughout. I'm so proud of you. I know that there was a lot of furious note taking, and we have some feminists in the crowd, like Shweta is here, Shivani is here. You have questions, I know. So let's open this up for some questions, and then we can all eat more afterwards.